Hi guys, it's been a while. My name is Tori, and today the video you picked just so happens to be a quite serious one. It's the reason pretty much I created this channel in the first place, and it's a heavy one, so I want to start off with a disclaimer. If you are bothered by a discussion of mental health, addiction, self-harm, then maybe this video is not for you. I'm going to be talking about my childhood and growing up, dealing with depression, and learning what depression was. I've always had depression. Some people develop it later in life. I happen to be one of the people that was born with it, or at least I strongly believe so. So first of all, my family has a history of genetic mental illness. It's just something that's in our blood. I've had symptoms since as young as 4, as young as I can remember. This manifested in me as extreme guilt. My parents even now talk about the fact that when I was young, I didn't have to be grounded. All they had to do was look at me in a funny way, and I would burst into tears. Like, I would literally cry because I had felt crushing guilt that I had disappointed someone who loved me. I remember telling myself when I was a child, if I did anything bad, that I was a bad kid, that I was a bad person. What kind of child does this? What's wrong with me? Those were all things I was thinking at 5 years old, and what 5-year-old should ever think that? And this wasn't because of the way that I grew up. My parents never told me that I was a bad child. In fact, it was quite the opposite. I was a gifted child, so to speak. I got really good grades. I was very well behaved. At one point in my childhood, I had done something bad. I went on an adult website. I was like 8, 9 years old. So I was 9 years old. I went on an adult website, and I felt extremely guilty about this. To me, at that age, only terrible people, only terrible kids would look up or be on adult websites. I felt so guilty. I was sitting on the bus, and I brought my hand up and I started digging my nails into my forehead. So much so that I left a big mark there, and my parents noticed when I got home and they asked me what it was. I said I didn't know, I must have hurt myself and didn't realize it, and they said, oh, like maybe it's acne. Now, at this age, I didn't even know what self-harm was. Like, it was not something that I had ever heard about. It was nothing that I saw on the internet. It was something I did to myself because I was punishing myself for something that brought me so much guilt that I felt that I deserved that. Years passed, 10, 11, and I was still racked with the guilt from that one thing. So much guilt, it would keep me up at night. It gave me stomach aches. I thought, what if they go into the history on that computer? I don't think I ever cleared the history. And looking back now and knowing how small that problem was and that it affected me so much over an adult website, a curious kid looking at an adult website. The guilt slowly lessened over the years as I learned that other kids were doing bad things too, and things that were way worse than what I did. So I had all these signs and symptoms of childhood depression that never got addressed. Mostly because I held it in myself and people didn't really know what was going on inside of me. So years passed and a lot of stuff happened. My parents split up. We moved out of the trailer park. We moved in with my grandparents. Then my parents split up, and then I was living with my mom, hopping from relative to relative's house. Long story short, I ended up living with one of my aunts while my mom moved back to our hometown and then eventually moved out of the country with her new husband. So I was living with my aunt. My dad was living in Kentucky at the time. My dad is an alcoholic. He had been drinking for my entire life at that point. I was around 13. My uncle, his brother, committed suicide. So that was kind of a low point for my dad. He quit drinking, and then he moved back into Pennsylvania, which is where I live, and he came and he got me, and I started to live with him. My dad had a good job, and then my dad started drinking again. And even before that, honestly, like, my mental health was not at a great place, and it wasn't because anything in my environment was doing it. I wasn't being bullied. I had friends. I was in the school musical. I had a life. I should have been happy, but I wasn't. I started to learn about, like, what self-harm actually was, and then my dad started drinking, and things got pretty bad. And I started to self-harm. My dad was in rehab at the time. His girlfriend was constantly working. We did not have any money anymore. We were very, very poor. I started to self-harm, and I hid it by wearing long sleeves, by wearing a bunch of bracelets, and nobody really knew. Until one day I decided that I wanted people to know. I wanted somebody to ask me what was wrong, because I was tired of sitting in the cafeteria with my friends feeling so numb inside, and I wanted someone to ask me what was wrong, and I kind of just expected them to notice. But that's the thing, depression doesn't look like anything, so how could I expect them to know that something was wrong with me? So one day I decided not to wear bracelets and not to wear long sleeves to lunch, and they noticed, and my friends asked me what it was, what the marks on my arms were. I told them my cat scratched me, and they didn't believe me, of course. And one of the girls at my table, who I didn't really know so well, goes, "Hey, Tori, I know those aren't cat scratches. I've been through it. If you ever need to talk, you can talk to me." And that kind of spoke volumes, but I actually never really did reach out to her, unfortunately. So I still didn't tell my parents about my self-harm. I wasn't really keeping that much contact with my mom because we had a very rocky relationship. My dad he got sober again, and we decided that it was in my best interest, because of our financial state, to go to a boarding school specifically for underprivileged children. That the only reason I even knew about this boarding school is because a school counselor at one of the schools that I had gone to had suggested that I check this place out. She knew about my mental health problems to a certain extent, and she thought that this could really help me out. Well, I went to the interview process for this school, and for some reason, okay, I'm sitting in this office, and they have someone from the school sit down with you and ask you a bunch of questions to make sure that you're in a good place to go to this boarding school, that you're healthy, and that you don't have behavioral issues. And one of the questions they asked me is, have you ever self-harmed? And I had, like, a week or two before. And for some reason, that was the moment that I said, I have to tell somebody. And so I said, yes, I have self-harmed. It was a whole process because that delayed me getting into the school. I ended up telling my dad about it. I also told him that I was bisexual, that I wasn't Christian, and that I was depressed. And yeah, I told him all that on the same day while sitting in the car with him. Like, just drop a steaming pile of garbage on my dad's lap, and he was very supportive because he understood. So I went to this boarding school. I ended up getting in after a series of psychology appointments where I lied to every freaking psychologist and said, yeah, I'm fine, I'm happy, I don't hate myself, I don't sleep all day. Yeah, those were all lies. So I got into this school, and that's when stuff kind of started to go really downhill. My mental health deteriorated fast. I'm like 16 years old at this point. I'm still self-harming, and I started to move the cuts to my belly because I knew that people wouldn't see them there, and that way I wouldn't have to explain anything, and that way I wouldn't get kicked out of the school. So I was in a really unhealthy place, and I was dating someone at the time. It was my first ever boyfriend, and we were really in love. He was a big deal to me, and I broke up with him because I was so depressed, and I didn't want to drag him into this mess with me, and I also didn't want to be around anyone. I wanted to isolate myself. I wanted to wall myself off. I thought that I was a burden and that anyone who was around me would be ruined by me. I wrote suicide notes and kept them in my backpack. That way, if I ever decided to end it, I wouldn't talk myself out of it while I was writing the suicide note. It was bad, but I broke up with him and I told him why. And then a few days later, after I had broken up with him, he found me in the hallway and took me to the psychologist's office, the counseling office, and helped me sign up for an appointment for therapy because he knew that I wasn't going to do it on my own. That was the major turning point. Things started to get better from that point on. I started going to therapy. I had an amazing counselor. I got on medication. I was hospitalized at one point for my depression, but there's just so much I could talk about. I've had ups and downs. That getting into counseling was not the end. It was not the end of my depression. It was not the end of my self-harm. But it was finally at that point when I sat in that therapist's office and she gave me the diagnostic test and then told me, I think you have depression. I finally had a name. I'm sorry. But I finally had a name to put to how I was feeling my whole life. I had a name for it. And it's major depression. Therapy is, or at least for me, it was a life changer. But I still have depression, and it has been very bad very recently. But I'm finally getting to a point in my life where I'm feeling motivated, where I'm feeling happy with myself. I'm waking up earlier, I'm exercising, which I never do. I'm not sleeping for 10, 12 hours a night. A lot of that coming from changing my outlook on life and trying to look at things as positively as I can. To think positive, and then good things will come to you. And to not just sit around and hope things eventually change, to start changing things myself. So that's my story with depression. That's not the whole story, and it certainly is not the end of the story, but that's who I am, and that's why I'm making these videos right now, because I'm finally getting to this point in my life where I accept my diagnosis, but I'm not letting it rule me anymore. And I'm sure I'm gonna have bad days still. I'm sure I'll have a lot of bad days, but I'm also going to have a lot of good days if I have anything to say about it. So thank you for watching. I hope that you can learn from this, relate to something in this, and know that if you are in that dark place like I have been, if you have depression, even if you were never diagnosed with it, that not only do things get better, it's not that your situation will change. You will always have depression if you have it. You might be stuck in a situation where you don't have money and there's not much that you can physically do about it, but what you can do about it is change the way you think. Stop blaming yourself for everything. Stop, making excuses for everything. You can wallow in your depression like I have for years, but when you start getting connected to yourself and looking at what your life really is and all the gifts that you have and everything you have at your disposal, it can get better. And it will get better the moment you start thinking like that. And I know that because it is for me.